At 5:30 in the morning on Christmas Day, 1989, an armored personnel carrier pulled into the courtyard of a military garrison in Târgoviște, Romania. The engine was running louder than necessary. That was deliberate. Sergeant Constantin Stoican had been told to rev it hard, to produce enough noise that no one outside the walls would hear who was getting out. 2 people stepped down from the vehicle and were escorted inside. One was a 71-year-old man who, 4 days earlier, had been the absolute ruler of this country. The other was his wife, 70 years old, who had been the second most powerful person in Romania for nearly a decade. They had been sleeping in the garrison for 3 nights, held in a room without knowing what came next. What came next had already been decided. The firing squad had been assembled before sunrise. The location where the execution would take place, a stretch of wall along the barracks square, had been selected the evening before. A general named Victor Stanculescu had received the order the previous night and spent the hours between then and dawn organizing the logistics. The trial that would condemn Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu to death was scheduled to begin in a matter of hours. The verdict was not part of the schedule. The verdict had been agreed upon before any charge was read aloud. To understand how a man who had ruled Romania for 24 years ended Christmas Day against a barracks wall, it helps to go back 9 days to a city in the west of the country called Timișoara, where the regime's final miscalculation began. Nicolae Ceaușescu had been General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party since 1965. By the late 1980s, Romania was one of the most repressive states in Eastern Europe. Food rationing, surveillance, the systematic demolition of villages to build collective housing, and a secret police force, the Securitate, that reached into every institution. Ceaușescu had also developed something unusual among communist leaders of his era, a cult of personality modeled more on North Korean lines than Soviet ones. He and Elena were referred to in state media with titles that belonged to ancient monarchies. He was the genius of the Carpathians. She was the mother of the nation. On December 16th, protests broke out in Timișoara after authorities moved to evict a dissident pastor named Laszlo Tokes. What began as a gathering in front of his building spread through the city in hours. Ceaușescu was not in Romania when it started. He had flown to Iran for a state visit. When he returned on December 20th, his first response was a televised speech blaming foreign interference. The following day, December 21st, he organized what the regime had done dozens of times before, a mass rally in Bucharest's Palace Square. Workers were bussed in, given flags and placards, and told where to stand and when to applaud. Approximately 100,000 people filled the square. Ceaușescu stepped onto the balcony of the Central Committee building and began to speak. He had done this so many times that the routine required no thought. The crowd was supposed to cheer. The cameras were supposed to confirm that the country supported its leader. State broadcasters were transmitting live. About 8 minutes into the speech, something happened that had not happened in 24 years. The crowd started booing. Contemporary accounts and video footage that survived the broadcast show what came next. The booing spread. Chants of Timișoara began rising from different parts of the square. Ceaușescu stopped speaking mid-sentence and said, "Hello," into the microphone several times, as if the problem were technical. Elena, visible beside him, could be heard telling the crowd to be quiet. Ceaușescu told her to be quiet first. The cameras briefly pointed toward the sky. The transmission was eventually cut, but not before the sound had gone out across the country. That moment, a dictator standing on a balcony saying hello to a crowd that was jeering him, broadcasting it live, is documented and visible. What it produced was not immediately obvious to Ceaușescu. He believed by most accounts of those who were with him in the following hours that the situation could still be managed. It could not. By the morning of December 22nd, the army had begun openly defecting to the protesters. The Central Committee building was being stormed. At 12 minutes past noon, Ceaușescu and Elena boarded a helicopter on the roof and left Bucharest. The pilot, a colonel named Vasile Maluțan, later stated that he told Ceaușescu mid-flight that they were in danger of being shot down by anti-aircraft positions and that he needed to land immediately. The claim has never been fully verified. What is documented is that the helicopter landed on a road near the town of Gaiești, far short of any intended destination. The Ceaușescus got into a car belonging to a private citizen named Nicolae Deca, who drove them toward Târgoviște. He then informed local authorities of who he had been carrying. By 6 in the evening on December 22nd, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were in the custody of a Târgoviște military garrison. They were held there for 3 days. On December 24th, the leadership of the new National Salvation Front, the group that had assumed power in Bucharest, decided the couple would be tried the following day. General Stănculescu was given the order that evening and dispatched to Târgoviște with instructions that included organizing both the proceedings and what was to follow them. The man who would serve as defense counsel learned about the assignment on the morning of December 25th. Nicu Teodorescu, one of Bucharest's prominent lawyers, was eating Christmas breakfast with his family when he received a telephone call from an aide to Ion Iliescu, the NSF's leading figure. He said it would be an interesting challenge and accepted. He arrived at the garrison and was given 10 minutes alone with his clients before the trial began. Teodorescu later described those 10 minutes in interviews. He told the Ceaușescus that their best chance of avoiding the death penalty was to plead mental incapacity. Elena, according to his account, called the suggestion an outrageous setup. Both of them, he said, felt insulted by the proposal. They rejected his help after that. The tribunal itself was composed of military judges. No formal file of evidence had been prepared. No prior criminal investigation had taken place. The charges were read from a list: genocide, with the number of victims stated as more than 60,000, subversion of state power, destruction of public property, undermining the national economy, and attempting to flee the country using more than $1 billion in foreign bank accounts. The genocide figure, 60,000, was not documented in any evidence presented to the court. It was not clear, even to those reporting at the time, whether it referred to the deaths during the revolution or to the full span of Ceaușescu's rule. No one at the trial attempted to clarify it. Ceaușescu refused to recognize the tribunal's authority from the opening minutes. He argued that the proceedings violated the 1965 Constitution, that only the Grand National Assembly had the power to remove him, and that what was happening was a coup organized by foreign agencies. He demanded to speak to the working class. He referred to the judges by dismissive terms and declined to answer charges directly. The presiding judge, Ghica Popa, told him at one point that the sham was what he had done for 25 years. At some point during the proceedings, the assigned defense lawyers stopped defending. Contemporary accounts describe them shifting to the prosecution side, joining in the accusations against their clients. No offer of proof was made in response to any of the charges. The trial, according to multiple sources who were present, lasted approximately 55 minutes to 1 hour. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the tribunal withdrew to deliberate. The deliberation was brief. The verdict was death. Under the decree establishing the exceptional military tribunal, there was no right of appeal. Teodorescu, in a later interview with the Times newspaper, described what happened after the sentence was announced. Ceaușescu, he said, showed nothing but contempt when the verdict was read. He told the prosecutor that when this was all over, he would be put on trial himself. Those present laughed. About 15 minutes after sentencing, soldiers led the couple out of the building and into a courtyard. Teodorescu's account of the next few seconds is precise and has not been substantially contradicted. He stated that he was approximately 90 feet away. He said that the first the Ceaușescus knew they were about to die was when the bullets reached them. The execution was carried out at 2:50 in the afternoon on December 25th, 1989. The firing squad was led by Captain Ionel Boru. In a 2014 interview with The Guardian, Boru described how he had specifically switched his rifle to fully automatic because he wanted to ensure the sentences were carried out quickly. He stated that at least one member of the squad hesitated for several seconds before firing. He believed, based on what he witnessed, that his shots alone were responsible for both deaths. The camera crew assigned to film the execution was not in position in time. Only the final rounds were captured. The footage of the bodies, shown on Romanian state television the following day, December 26th, was intended as proof that the former rulers were dead, not a rumor, not in exile, not being smuggled toward some border. The images showed what the images showed. What the images could not show, and what the television broadcast did not mention, was that the trial producing the verdict in those images had lasted less than an hour and had begun with the execution site already selected. Romania's revolution cost more than 1,100 lives in total. Most of them after the Ceaușescus were already in custody. The judge who presided over the tribunal, Ghica Popa, died in March 1990. The official ruling was suicide. Subsequent investigations into the events of December 1989 continued for decades, with prosecutions, European court rulings, and parliamentary inquiries generating more questions than conclusions. Ion Iliescu, who led the National Salvation Front and ordered the trial, was later charged with crimes against humanity in connection with the events following December 22nd. The charge related to the deaths that occurred after the NSF took power, not to the trial at Târgoviște. At the time of those charges, he denied ordering the summary execution of the Ceaușescus, though the documentary record of who gave the order to General Stănculescu on the evening of December 24th is not a matter of serious historical dispute. Nicu Teodorescu, the defense counsel with 10 minutes of preparation time, said in that same interview that the Ceaușescus had believed, even in their final hours, that they would be rescued by their own forces, by loyalists, by someone. He did not say whether he believed them. The engine that Sergeant Stoican revved in the courtyard at 5:30 that morning was meant to mask an arrival. What it could not mask was the structure of everything that came after it, a process designed to look like justice and move like an execution, in a country where, for 24 years, the two had been difficult to tell apart.